Can you all hear me?
Good morning.
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello. Good evening. Perfect. I'm sorry for the hassle. I could not get into this session. Kira Toto, are we there? Is everyone there? Yes, are we ready to start?
Yes, Daniela, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Kira Koto, welcome to the Antarctic Science and Political Priorities panel discussion. My name is Daniela Liggett. I'm from the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand. And I've been asked by Peter Roberts to step in for him and chair this panel discussion. Unfortunately, Peter's intercontinental flight which was scheduled for later today, has been brought forward. And as you all know these days, when your airline changes your travel time, you better be ready. So I joined on last minute, and apologies for the chaotic start. I had some issues with my computer this morning. So we are all looking really forward to this panel discussion, and we hope that what we'll discuss today will actually stimulate further discussion on what place Antarctic research in general, and SCAR in particular, has in a world where social justice and environmental concerns appear more pressing than ever before. We have a team of 5 esteemed panelists who will be well known by many of you. And I'd like to welcome them all in, and now in alphabetical order. I'll give you a short bio so that you know who you've got in front of you. So Claire Christian is Executive Director of the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, ASOC. Claire has an MA in International Affairs from the American University School of International Service and has worked for ASOC since 2009. She coordinates policy and strategy related to many issues that impact the Antarctic environment, including tourism, fisheries, marine protected areas, and climate change. Then we have Jefferson Simões, who's a professor of polar geography and glaciology at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Porto Alegre in Brazil. And he received his PhD from the Scott Polar Research Institute at the University of Cambridge in 1990, and since then has been involved in Antarctic, working on Antarctic and Andean glaciers. His academic interest covers a really wide area from glaciology to issues of science diplomacy, and including the geopolitics of the polar region. And he's also the Brazilian national delegate, and as we all know, one of the SCAR vice president, the one for finance. And we've got Dr. Morgan Seag, who's a SCAR fellow who recently completed her PhD at the University of Cambridge. And her doctoral research focused on the sociocultural, political, and historical dimensions of Antarctic science, and has resulted in a really interesting PhD thesis that I encourage everyone to read. As a SCAR fellow, she's been working in collaboration with researchers from the University of Tasmania to study intersectional gender inequality in Antarctic research. And she also works at the Global Mountains Director for the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, where she connects cryosphere science to international climate policy. And then we have Dr. Lize-Marie van der Watt, who's a historian and researcher at the Division for History of Science, Technology and Environment at KTH, Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. And her work focuses on the intersections of politics, the environment, and science in the polar regions from the 1950s onwards. More recently, she's turned her focus to critical heritage studies in the Antarctic context, specifically exploring decay as heritage practice. And we also have Dr. Priscilla Wehi, Associate Professor and Director of the Te Pūnaha Matahini Center of Research, Excellence in Complex Systems at the University of Otago in New Zealand. And Priscilla has degrees in the sciences and humanities and focuses her work on conservation and the relationships between humans and other forms of nature. She also works on socio-ecological systems and is part of a team exploring how Maori concepts of stewardship connect with the Antarctic. So welcome everyone. It's nice to have you all here. And I will now in turn ask each of our panelists one question to get the discussion started, but other panelists are all invited to join in and offer your thoughts too. And we welcome everyone's audience's thoughts and questions too. Please type them in the Q&A, which we will check and then relay to the panelists as we go on. And just so that everyone is aware, the session is recorded and will be made available to registered participants in the past events section of the events platform. And the organizers are also aiming to upload the recordings to the YouTube channel. And obviously, the presenters know that they still have the option to afterwards review this and opt out. So without further ado, let's jump right in with the first pertinent question, which I'd really like Jefferson to address. Jefferson, does the ongoing climate emergency make the work of SCAR more relevant?
I do believe yes. And in fact, at a time of disinformation, a time of, if you would like to call fake news, and a time that science sometimes in some countries suffer really a war, a source of reliable and independent information about climate change, about the changes we are seeing elsewhere, not only in Antarctica, but Antarctica is, we know that it gives a early warning and stronger signal of changes. It's essential to have an institution that defends the truth. We can deal with these issues, of course, given a proper information, truthful understanding for the truth, and make clear what we are doing, and of course to play in some ways, to play the game that we have nowadays in the discussions worldwide. I think that it goes further than just the climate change and the changes that we are observing in the environment. But we must be aware that we need to show this every day. It has been challenging, not only for the question of climate change.
Thank you, Jefferson. May I just quickly follow up and ask maybe you and also the other panelists how we can best or maybe better share those understandings and research that we've uncovered that sends very strong signals for action, but are we presently doing a good job of sharing that and stimulating action?
Shall I talk, or someone else would like to?
Yes, and please, if anyone else, just unmute yourself because we can see that and we can hand over to you then.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think that it's becoming more and more important for any kind of institution to understand the new media, to act in different kind of, not only social media, to understand that there is not nowadays in the modern society an self-justified organization. We need to always be aware that we need to show to the people in general, to the laymen, to people that vote or the people that take decisions, and to people and people in general, what we're doing. And I think that one of the great difference, if you look behind the last generation, the generation before myself, it was understood that, for example, finance would come to science without any kind of effort. Of course, it depends a lot on different moments of the history of each country, the history of science, if the science was already or not inserted in the development of the one economy. But even in those countries that have a high level of education, we still are having problems with at the moment that the social media appeared. And of course, it's, you see, maybe I'm looking from the side of South America, but I'm seeing the same thing in other countries, even in the United States, people become against science. And it was understood before that, okay, we would do social science, you would do and work with natural sciences without considering other questions. It would be independent of the things that were happening around you. That's no more. And that you bring one question that Daniela knows very well, my opinion, that the importance of bringing to not only to SCAR, but to any scientific society, the question of humanities and social sciences. And that is a movement that began even in the International Science Committee. Now is the International Science Council that has to put together the natural and the social science. Because, of course, we are well, it's clear, but sometimes the last generation didn't recognize that we need to work together. And it's, if not, we stay apart of the society. It's not, we don't have any guarantee that money is going to flow towards natural sciences. And if we don't enlarge our view and interact with different parts of the modern society.
Thank you, Jefferson. Thank you for this detailed response. I see we do have one question from Heather, which I'll take after we've heard also from the other speakers. But if anyone else has pertinent questions on this topic, please type them into the Q&A session. And let me just now also look at other issues. We try to stimulate a number of issues across the board and have the panelists respond and ask you your questions as well. So second question to Morgan would be that, well, SCAR has firmly embraced equity and diversity issues in recent years. What more can be done in terms of gender equity?
That's a great question and a big question, and one that I think is being posed and addressed throughout this conference. There'll be 2 sessions on inclusivity in Antarctic research during this conference, and there's a workshop taking place next week on the issue as well, not just focused on gender, but the underrepresentation of all historically excluded groups. The question of what more can be done, I think, is important to start by acknowledging that a lot more not only can, but needs to be done. It's been raised quite a bit, and I think would be remiss to not note that the opening ceremony was an all-male lineup of speakers, which is something that I think as the SCAR community, we have to redress moving forward in all of our SCAR events. But I think that there are a few ways that we as the Antarctic research community can think differently about gender inequality specifically that can help us to make progress more quickly, more holistically, more sustainably and effectively. One of which is to move beyond what remains a persistent focus on underrepresentation often of women, but also, of course, of non-binary people. We know that there are demographic disparities in this community. Women, for example, were categorically barred from conducting Antarctic fieldwork across the world through much of the 20th century, and progress in some places was very gradual. Women didn't achieve equal opportunities in some countries until the mid-1990s. So that's clear and beyond dispute. But what I think we need to do to move forward is to talk more about structural barriers that keep women and non-binary people from participating on an equal basis, from thriving in the community. These are barriers to inclusivity, to equity, to justice in the community. Those structural barriers being aspects of our culture, our practices, our policies that are woven into the fabric of Antarctic research institutions. There's loads of literature on this. Very happy to drop some into the chat later, or do a Google. If you search for gender in Antarctic research, you'll find lots on it. Another sort of conceptual lens that I think that our community can, should, maybe must adopt as we try to improve gender equality in our community is a framework called intersectionality, which many people will be aware of, although I think probably not everybody. So I'll try to explain quite foundationally that intersectionality is a way of looking at inequalities that acknowledges diversity within social groups. So for example, if we're talking about women, acknowledging that women is not a monolithic category, that women have multiple complex identities, as everybody does. And so women may experience compounding barriers at the intersections of multiple social structures. For example, some women experience racism or ableism, discrimination along many axes that are relevant to their own personal identities. And finally, I would encourage through this intersectional lens that the community start paying closer attention to issues at the international level. I think even our equality, diversity, and inclusivity discourses, EDI discourses, remain heavily dominated by Western voices. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to gender equality or to any form of social inequality, including in Antarctic research. And I think we're finding in our, for example, international collaborations, we may have cultural norms or practices or national policies that are not in alignment with one another, that may come into tension with one another. We may find our identities or the challenges that we face shifting as we move across scales, whether you're in your lab or at a nationwide conference or working as part of a huge international collaboration. So I'm raising a lot of issues rather than solutions. I think, however, it's important to start from this starting point to acknowledge that there are still issues that we aren't discussing enough. And there are lots of solutions out there. In fact, my collaboration team through the SCAR Fellowship is submitting a paper very soon with some proposed solutions along these lines. But I encourage everybody to think about these things in this holistic, intersectional, and international way, and start that conversation rolling. And do join our workshop next week where we'll be talking about these issues. We want to hear from everybody who is interested and willing to participate.
Thank you, Morgan.
Sorry, Daniela, can I tag on to that? That Morgan just said. Partly I have a question for Morgan. I'm not sure if we're allowed to post questions to other panelists. I'll start with that. Just quickly, in a very physical, practical way, gender inequality in Antarctica has come to light in the past, I think it was about 5 years ago, in terms of sexism and harassment in field work. And I completely agree with what you say. There's cultural norms, and of course, one culture is not more or less sexist than another, but I'm prefacing what I'm about to suggest next with that for a good reason. Would you think there's a space for something where SCAR, using the network of researchers with expertise in gender that is already there, can perhaps work together with ComNAP to, for example, have a best practices field manual for science in the field that takes into account these intersectional issues? So that's one of the issues. And then I see in the questions that somebody asked about embrace participants with disabilities. and Antarctic community. And I think there's a very real conversation that needs to be had in terms of what also counts as Antarctic research. Of course, certain disabilities does not preclude you from actually going to do fieldwork in Antarctica, but some unfortunately will. But that also brings me to the question then, does going to Antarctica make you an Antarctic researcher? Which I think also plays into this, the way in which long field seasons are not compatible with family life, for example. And unfortunately, even in the most progressive of countries, that burden still falls on women, for example. So yes, also other opportunities to do kinds of field work or technologies, perhaps.
Thank you, Lize-Marie. And I think there's a direct challenge for Morgan to and team to ensure that this goes into ComNab in one way or another. Morgan, you wanted to respond?
I'll accept that challenge. So briefly first responding to the question about sexual harassment as an example of a global issue that encounters particular challenges at the international level. I think that you're spot on that SCAR has a really unique and uniquely valuable role to play here, because it is our representative international organization in the field of Antarctic research. And many of you, but maybe not everybody who's participating in the audience, will be aware that SCAR has recently launched an Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion Action Group, the EDI Action Group. And I strongly encourage everybody to sign up for that action group. The full membership is quite wide, always looking for new members and new opportunities, ideas about how we can engage. I think that best practices are exactly the kind of thing that that group is considering. And briefly, I also wanted to touch on the issue of researchers with disabilities, because that's one that I think is beginning to emerge as more at the forefront of these conversations, but we have a very long way to go there. I want to highlight two things briefly, one of which is that I think we can actually turn to the field of space exploration on this, which will probably surprise a lot of people. But space exploration is making remarkable strides in some ways towards including astronauts with disabilities in the European Space Agency, for example. There are some wonderful resources, webinars, for example, about why astronauts or would-be astronauts with disabilities might be uniquely suited to space exploration. So I think we can learn from those conversations. Antarctic research is exceptional in some ways, but not in others, and we can and should be in dialogue with those working in cognate spaces and related fields. And also, once again, to plug the inclusivity sessions, there's a network called Accessibility in Polar Research. I'm so sorry to the team. I can't remember if it's Antarctic or Polar Research, but they will be presenting at the inclusivity session and participating in the workshop next week. And we are looking forward to learning a lot more from this network as time goes on. Find them on Twitter as well.
Thank you, Morgan and Lize-Marie. That's clearly a topic that is of interest to many and requires further discussion, of course. So we welcome your questions in the Q&A, which I see coming in, and I'll get back to once we've gone through the panelists. I've actually got a third question that is somewhat related for Lize-Marie. So at a time when the Black Lives Matter movement and similar campaigns have focused attention on ongoing social injustice issues, does SCAR have a role to play in ensuring that participation in Antarctic science reflects the diversity of the populations of SCAR member states more generally?
Yes, I think there is a role to play, and I want to get back to the concept of intersectionality as well, that there are, of course, other constraints as well. I see there's a discussion going on in the question and answer session already about participation, for example, from countries who do not, who are not consultative members of the Antarctic Treaty or who do not have their own national Antarctic programs, engaging or trying to network out these kinds of shifts of opportunity, for example. There is, of course, also another part of this, and that is not just participation in doing the science, but also who the science is done for, or which communities are targeted. And I think we all know that this the people who will and who are being most affected by climate change are not people who necessarily even know that Antarctica exists. I mean, it's and through no fault of their own. It is often people with from poorer countries, low-lying countries, island nations, etc., that are already affected by climate changes in Antarctica. And I think we also have a responsibility there. And SCAR also has perhaps a responsibility there to sometimes raise its head above the parapet and actually mention impact and climate impacts that Antarctica has beyond Antarctica, in not only large theoretical or physical terms, but also in these real human terms. And I realize there are constraints in what can and cannot be decided and discussed. At, for example, the ATCM, which is where they provide policy advice at request of the ATCM. But yes, perhaps that is also something that can be done. At the same time, it is a very careful balance. I think one of the things that SCAR is doing well and should continue doing is trying to hold that integrity as independent scientific advisor. But the science also shows that the impact of climate change are not equal. And I don't think it is unfair to say, yes, of course, scientists going to Antarctica are also impacted by climate change, but they're possibly not the people who will suffer the most first.
Thank you, Lize-Marie. I think you already addressed some of the questions that are coming through in the Q&A, which you've done really nicely, but we'll probably get back to them soon. So now, Priscilla, I've got a question for you. Should or could SCAR's mandate embrace knowledge systems from indigenous cultures that, like science, provide ways of understanding the natural world?
Thanks, Daniela. I think this also goes back to what Lize-Marie's just been talking about, which is the disconnect between those who are involved in the science or the research, those who shape the questions, and those who are most affected by climate change. So I think just to acknowledge that huge disconnect, which is really important for Indigenous peoples. So I think one of the first things we need to acknowledge or ask ourselves is, who are the people sitting at the decision-making tables, and how can we be more inclusive in terms of those groups? So that would be the first thing I'd say. So yeah, the sense or the question around whose ideas are privileged, who decides the questions that matter. I think this is the first important point when it comes to Indigenous peoples, but also, of course, as we've heard already from many other groups, because what we know is that when we have diverse research teams, the research is stronger and better. So there's been quite a lot of research into that. And so despite the fact that sometimes sparkling qualifications can be incredibly attractive, there is huge benefit from having diverse teams and bringing different perspectives. One of the things that really influences is the paradigms within which we operate. So what are the paradigms within which we do our science? So for example, if I was talking about Indigenous peoples, I might talk about a much more holistic approach to research. And just for those of you who don't know me, to situate myself a little bit better, and I should have done this first really, to say kia ora tātou, kia koutou katoa. So I lead what we call a Vision Mātauranga research team within New Zealand in an Antarctic program. I'm a biologist by training, but I suppose the reason I was asked to lead this team is because although I'm a New Zealander of what we would call European descent, I live within an Indigenous Māori community. So that's been my community for the last 35 years. Scary, these numbers, isn't it? And so my community is very important in terms of how I do the work that I do, the science, the questions, the people that I interact with. And so within a Vision Mātauranga team, our goal is to uplift those communities, to bring those perspectives to the table, to unlock, in the words, this is government speak, but to unlock the potential of that kind of thinking, of bringing those paradigms to the table. So one of the things that actually, we can go back and talk about paradigms. So when we understand what knowledge is, if we think about Māori knowledge, we often talk about a Māori knowledge system, because knowledge is situated within a community or a culture, and therefore the worldview of the community and the beliefs of the community and the practices of the community are all incredibly important to both the maintaining and the extending of that knowledge. And I think that that's something as scientists that we often don't recognize well, that our science, if we think about the Antarctic treaty system, for example, we can say it's all about peace and science, but actually our science is used in multiple different ways. It can be used if we are working on toothfish populations, for example, that might be used in the service of conservation, or it might be used in the service of fishing or for commercial purposes, for example. So science can be used in multiple different ways, and so therefore is situated within the worldviews and the practices and all of those other things that are going on. So I think, yes, Indigenous peoples, even within that particular paradigm, have something to offer to remind us as scientists about the way that our work is used. And so one of the big ideas that I would bring here is around relationality. So where humans don't sit outside of nature. So it's about connectivity, the connections that we have. And I think, you know, in Māori, we might say something like, I am the river and the river is me. So it's about that very deep connection. And I know that many Antarctic researchers actually feel very deep connection to Antarctica. So this is something that you might not actually be unfamiliar with, or perhaps even if you're not an Antarctic researcher, you might still feel a deep sense of connection that feeds into a sense of stewardship, for example. And so this is one of the things that we're exploring. How can you enact or feel part of a stewardship movement if you are actually physically at a great distance from a place? So this is where I think also we're talking at the moment about Indigenous knowledge and the value of bringing these different ways of knowing. But again, I'd say, actually, let's extend that and say the humanities, the social sciences, art, all of these different ways of exploring knowledge are incredibly important, because, you know, to go back to what Jefferson was saying about, is the work of Scar more relevant now? You know, we could, I'm going to sort of riff from a Japanese proverb and say, you know, the best time to actually do Antarctic research, or when it was most relevant, was probably 50 years ago, before we even knew that it was relevant. The next best time for it to be relevant is now. And so this is one of the issues. Often when we live in this present moment, we don't actually yet know what the challenges of the next 50 or 100 years may be. And so it's incredibly important for us to realize that many of these issues have been going for many, many years. We may not yet see them, or they may, you know, the lens may not yet be polished for us to understand the best approach to something. And so the work of Scar, to cut to the chase, the work of Scar is incredibly important. but we don't always understand exactly why. And so I think we need to do our work in good faith. But so I've talked a bit about whose ideas are privileged. I've talked a little bit about paradigms. I just also want to highlight the lack of data. So when we talk, for example, about, perhaps there's a lack of women in Antarctic research, what we've discovered here in New Zealand is actually we have really poor data. And if we are to make progress, we actually need to know, and I would argue for transparent data, so publicly available data, showing exactly how many women is it that we send to Antarctica and for how long each year. Are there Indigenous peoples or Black people or people with disabilities who are part of the Antarctic research community? So what I can say is here in New Zealand, we don't actually know those things, which seems pretty incredible in this day and age. So how can we do better when we don't know what our baseline is? Incredibly difficult. But, if people don't have to declare these things, I think there is a temptation to go on as we are, feeling that we're doing the best that we can, but without taking that step to actually reflect on how we truly can do better. So yeah, that's just a few thoughts around Indigenous peoples. But I would also, just to sum up, say, I feel that it's all of our responsibility to do better, to be more inclusive. Often we find in our team that people look to us to make a change. And I would hold up that mirror and say, actually, it's up to all of us to help create positive change. It's not good enough to put yet another burden on a community that's working very hard to grow new researchers. To give us yet one more burden and not take responsibility for it is not okay. So it's up to all of us to do better. So kia ora tātou.
Kia ora, Priscilla. A lot of food for thought there, and I can see already that several of you are thinking about potential responses, so maybe hold them until we have asked Claire what messages might SCAR take to more strongly encourage environmental responsibility in Antarctic research.
Yeah, thank you, Daniela. Well, actually, honestly, I think a lot of what Priscilla just said is what you need to do. Talking about the paradigm and who's shaping the questions and who's affected. I think something that I've noticed that many scientists often like to think of themselves as purely objective, but I personally don't believe that any human being is purely objective. And I think cognitive science bears me out on that. We all have our own biases and our, little ways of thinking. And I think if you really want to be inclusive, if you really want to get to a better environmental future, you need to ask yourself all the time, where are the errors in my thinking? Where can I learn from other people? Because I think it's quite clear that the way that we've all been thinking about the Earth and how we live on it has not really worked out. So we need some new ideas and some new thinking and some new paradigms about how we relate to the natural world. And so I think a little humility in understanding, like Scylla's great example, which is one I use in a similar way all the time. We can think about toothfish as something to preserve because they're an important part of the ecosystem, or we can look at toothfish and say, okay, let me calculate how many of these I can kill a year and not cause the population to collapse. Those are two very different ways of looking at toothfish. They're both science, but our values inform what we're going to do with those respective things of science. Are we going to say, well, sure, we could fish here for toothfish this year, but actually there's a really rich ecosystem here, so maybe we'll benefit more from creating a marine protected area. So I think we always need to be thinking about those kinds of questions and how we're approaching those kinds of questions to become more environmentally responsible. I think just as a general rule, obviously, a lot of the work that SCAR scientists do is by nature environmentally responsible, because they're telling us about the impacts that our activities are having on the planet and on Antarctica, and you know, giving us a very powerful motivation to change our ways before we create even more damage to our natural systems, and, you know, natural systems that keep us all alive. But just kind of on a more granular level, I would just say, thinking about that paradigm, you know, why are we doing this research? Who is it for? What am I trying to accomplish with it? I don't think that makes you any less objective. I think it just makes you more objective in a way, because you're really trying to challenge yourself to see through your own blinders. And I think something that I was thinking about also, in terms of just whether it's environmental responsibility or even just inclusivity, you know, like what Scylla was saying, again, sorry to keep referring back to your speech, but you said a lot of things that I like to talk about myself all the time. So, you know, we're always looking to somebody else, but the questions I think we can all ask ourselves all the time are, you know, what power do I have and how can I use that power? So if we're thinking about, you know, again, toothfish research, if the pressure is coming in to research, you know, the health of the toothfish population and how much we can fish of it, you might push back and say, you know, is this the best thing to do right now? You know, if the question is diversity and inclusivity, it's like you might have the power to reach out to communities that maybe aren't involved in Antarctic research, or maybe aren't involved in Antarctic science that much. And, you know, you can reach out to them and explain to them the value of it, and maybe encourage that next generation of researchers. So yeah, I think basically, you know, there's just a lot that individuals and SCAR can do as an institution, just to constantly be reevaluating, you know, what their priorities are and whether those are truly, you know, serving the needs of Antarctica as, you know, a region and an ecosystem. So yeah.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, everyone, for these really thought-provoking little talks that you gave. Let us now turn our attention to some of the questions that have been asked and also upvoted. And I will pose those to all of you, and please just jump in and offer an answer if you have one. No pressure though. So Heather Lynch asked, what issues are currently blocked by the need for more science? And which issues are sufficiently well understood for policymakers to act, but are blocked by the lack of political will? Who wants to take that? Who wants to be the first? Claire.
Well, I mean, I'm from an advocacy-based NGO, so you should know that's where my bias is. But I would say most of the questions are blocked by political will. You know, there is a tremendous amount, I think, as everyone has seen from SCAR this year with their most recent report, there is a tremendous amount of information on the effects of climate change on Antarctica and on the possible negative effects for the rest of the world if, you know, climate change continues to affect Antarctica. And from what we see as an organization trying to advocate for policymakers to take action is that it really is just political will. The vast majority of countries in the Antarctic Treaty System are motivated to take action, and they would like to, but it's a consensus-based system, and there isn't full consensus on many of the policies that would be needed to address climate change within the Antarctic Treaty System and at a global level. You know, also, I always like to point out, you know, the way our global governance is set up, you know, Antarctica is kind of walled off, but I think if climate change research shows us anything, it's that, you know, this is a global problem and it requires global solutions. So it's kind of crazy that all these countries go to the Antarctic Treaty System and they listen to SCAR's research, they fund the research that SCAR scientists are doing, and then they go to the UNFCCC and they don't act on it, you know? So I really don't think, you know, at least in terms of climate change, you know, the messages are coming from scientists very clearly. And it's really, I think, up to political actors to, you know, have a little courage and also spend a little political capital in making sure that they get to consensus and get to bigger actions to reduce emissions on a global scale. So, not to say that there isn't more science and more things to learn, but we know enough to take action, certainly. And there are just a few countries, unfortunately, that are determined to block all of that action for reasons that I can only speculate about. So
I'd like to just follow on from Claire and play devil's advocate here, actually. So I want to do a thought experiment with everybody here and say, if we agree with Claire, and I do, so let me lay that down, and we are not seeing action around climate change, not because we don't have enough information, but because the message is not getting through in some way. What would it be like if we spent no money on what we would traditionally call Antarctic science and put the same amount of money towards communicating, not only in languages like English, because we know actually we need to reach a much broader audience. So we focused all of that money and resource instead on communication. So on artists working with Antarctic scientists, on humanities and social sciences, if all of that resource went to those disciplines, or people writing, philosophers, people who communicate in languages other than English, what would it be like if we put all of that resource into that? Would that create the change that we're looking for? And I'm reminded that yesterday I'd like to recommend actually a really powerful essay that Rebecca Priestley wrote, and that's just been published in the Griffith Review, which is about sea level rise. Incredibly powerful. And I wonder how much impact pieces like that might have now that we actually do have a reasonable grasp of the facts. And I do agree with Claire, there's always things that we do need to do. But nevertheless, could we think outside the square in different ways?
Morgan, you're next up.
I agree very strongly with everything that Claire and Priscilla have said. And I thought I might add a couple of other thoughts to the conversation. One of which I think follows on from what Scylla was saying, in terms of the responsibility that I think the entire research community has to be conscious of how we talk about the continent and the region, that we're all contributing to public ideas of what this place is about, and that much of our narratives, at least in the context that I've been working in, which are North America and Western Europe, I think the same would go for much of Oceania and elsewhere in the world, or the ideas that we share about Antarctica are still wrapped up in these heroic narratives, which depict the continent as a place primarily for white, cisgendered, non-disabled men from relatively wealthy countries. And those narratives show the continent as an exceptional place. It's extraordinary. It's the highest, driest, windy. We've all memorized all these superlatives about the continent, and they're true, and they have inspired lots of people to be in awe of the continent, but they don't inspire connection necessarily. They can do quite the opposite because they are so exclusionary historically. And it's worth thinking about how we can reframe our narratives of the continent so that people connect with them on a more personal level. What Claire was saying about, thinking not just about the impacts of climate change on Antarctica, but the impacts of climate change from Antarctica on the entire globe, because those are real. They could be severe, they could be catastrophic. And that kind of shift from seeing Antarctica as exceptional to more entangled in natural and human systems. I think we can all think about that in, when we're on NPR and talking about the continent, when we're posting photos on our blog, are we in a heroic pose by ourselves, suggesting that Antarctic research is something done by individuals heroically striding across the ice, or are we members of teams that collaborate and build on generations before us? And on a more practical level, I'd also mention that I'm not here representing the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, but that is a hat I wear. So speaking from the ICCI perspective, I think that policymakers also feel constrained by lack of public will, which emphasizes the need for what both Claire and Scylla are talking about shifting narratives and helping people think differently, but also they're constrained by the idea that long-term is in the year 2100. And this is something I'm not sure everybody's aware of, but within UNFCCC, they talk about long-term impacts as centering around the year 2100, when Antarctic researchers know many of the most significant impacts are going to happen after that. So this is something that we can all keep in mind in the conversations that we have, advocate for longer term thinking, even though that makes it very hard for politicians who are constrained by a 4-year term or whatever they are, but to encourage longer term thinking about our children, our grandchildren, their grandchildren, and say these are potentially irreversible impacts that we have the opportunity now to forestall, but we won't forever. So now is the moment to act.
And again, I'd just add that's very aligned with Indigenous thinking, which emphasizes intergenerationality and the importance of leaving the world in a better place for our grandchildren.
I also want to add something. First of all, that I think that's also a very important thing to take in mind, is this long-term generational legacy, also for those countries that do not have 4-year election cycles or only have them on paper, but not really in practice. And that is also something we have to consider, is that much of this political will could also be very constrained in certain places, because the public will and the political will is difficult to influence. So we should definitely do what we can do and have the power to do, but we also have to think very carefully, and it's a very careful line to tread of how to work with places that and the political will where it's not as democratic as one would wish it to be, and science also thrives in democracy. So it's a balance, but I think exactly what Morgan said is one can do more long-term, communicate long-term impacts. That might be a way to speak to more audiences.
Thank you all. I think it is quite clear here that we are not just talking about policymakers, but the wider public and pretty much every human being on Earth, to understand what is needed to be done and do their utmost, which is not always possible, I realize, for all people. And this, I think, resonates also in some of the questions that we've received, for instance, from Monica Mulbert, apologies if I don't pronounce your name correctly, who asked that why is it that our message does not get through to policymakers at every decision level, global, regional, local. It seems that also, although climate change is undeniable, action is taking a long way to percolate to crucial actors, which is exactly what you've just addressed. But how then could we stimulate action beyond communication? And if so, following up on that, I do want to jump in there with a question that Kevin Hughes asked, who said, how can Antarctic policymakers better communicate their science needs to researchers? So it's the other way around, recognizing that the two groups don't always share a common language. So this, again, is a lot about communication and information and knowledge transfers. Does anyone want to take those two questions? You're muted, Jefferson.
Yeah, well, I think that the great challenge now that the scientific community has is to understand that our training, the way that we should go much deeper than I'm going to use the word only training for scientific investigation. We must understand that we are we are in the middle of the society, and we must interact with different in different ways with different parts of the society. You must be training as a manager, maybe, or certain with have some psychological, social psychology training to understand the political way, the way that people work. And the thing that's quite clear, you cannot become isolated inside of our own community. And that's the challenge. Because the thing that has happened, there are some analysis that after the World War, the Second World War, in some developed countries, money for science came quite easily, self-justified, for example, with the atomic age. And it's becoming powerful, but that is coming to an end in several countries. And we must, and one of the causes that we lost in some ways interaction of the different parts of society, the political, and that has brought us into a way that makes things much more difficult to convince. But on the other hand, we must be aware that, for example, the question of climate change and the lack of action that we are seeing is not only because of information, is because of political decisions and even campaign to disinform, to deny. It's much more related to denialism of the things that are happening. Even to deny that the model of the economic model that we still have in the world is unsustainable. And that when you say that, it's coming quite against values, political, and the way that people perceive reality in the Western society. Is to believe that the way that we are working in this environment, in this planet, the small planet, is can go along the next centuries in the same way, basically exploiting all the resources as much as possible and not taking care of any consequences, believing, well, there's a say that the only people that believe that a finite planet has infinite resources are the economists. But exactly that challenge, and that comes. Yes, I agree with you. I agree with Priscilla said that very well. That to understand our position in this in this world, in our short life, how we are going to relate to it. If we are really in synergy of the world around us, I think that's big, very deep questions, much more than just the way that SCAR can deal. We have challenges here.
Absolutely, Jefferson, I think, and that's where the systemic change is really necessary in terms of our global economy and the foundation upon which it sits, and also in terms of ensuring that everyone can be taken along and has something to say, because a lot of the issues that we are seeing that you've all highlighted probably come from a point of disempowerment and dissatisfaction with livelihoods, which is something that we probably can't solve here. But back to Antarctica, and there's quite an interesting side discussion also going on, which I encourage everyone to have a look at in the Q&A between Renuka, Bade, Kevin Hughes, Chandrika Nath, and Monica Milbert around this question of how we can create greater collaboration and literacy in both directions between science and policy in order to address pertinent issues that focus on climate change, for instance, but go much beyond that, which is very interesting, and which I also invite the panel to respond to if they wish. And I see Lize-Marie has unmuted her microphone. Lize-Marie?
Yes, it's not as a direct response to that, but indirectly does relate, and also to what Jefferson just spoke about, and politics in general, is I think, and I don't have a suggestion on how to do this, but one of the things we shouldn't lose sight of is the role of industry. Yes, there's politics. Yes, policymakers can constrain industry, but more often than not, they can't. I mean, how do we communicate this to the platforms where this information is spread, to Meta, to Alphabet? I mean, what role does Antarctic researchers, if any, or even the Antarctic treaty system in general, have to communicate also with, for example, very powerful multinational companies that sometimes have more power than government, or very powerful industries that operate on the borderline? In Antarctic specific context, I can imagine that some fisheries operate like that they do not necessarily adhere to the policies of Antarctic Treaty Party because they're not registered there, and these kinds of sort of late capitalist stage of how industry is reacting, and I feel like I'm throwing a dog in the hen house, as we say in my mother tongue, Afrikaans. But of course, there's also this dimension that we speak about less often, certainly on forums like these.
Thank you, Lize-Marie. Really, really important points that you raise, and important questions about industry, which I understand we've always been a bit shy about interacting with and communicating to, and involving in a more inclusive approach to Antarctic science. But talking about this kind of outreach and inclusivity, we've had a number of questions regarding involvement in polar research, for instance, by Javier Alejandro Sanchez Moreno, who asked whether it is possible for someone who lives in a country without a national Antarctic program to get involved with Antarctic research. If so, how? And I'm sure that we've got the capacity here to quickly address that. And a related question by an anonymous attendee about participants with disabilities. And I would ask that more broadly, and you've already touched on that, but how can we ensure more proactively that those researchers, potential future researchers, can be embraced in the community? So I throw that out there to you all. Morgan?
I'll touch on the second question, beginning by saying I'm not an expert on disabilities. My expertise is in gender, and I try to work through an intersectional lens, so that involves thinking about people with various disabilities to an extent. But I think in any conversation about equity, inclusivity, a huge part of the answer is to center the voices of the people who are impacted. For those of us who are in the majority, or who are not impacted by the barriers that, for example, people with disabilities might face, to do a lot of listening, a lot of amplifying, and those of us with access to resources in positions of institutional authority to materially support the work of people who are trying to make a difference in these areas. And so, to my knowledge and my experience, I've again been learning a lot from accessibility and polar research. I think they're one of the first organizations, and I believe that they're an organization started by a group of early career researchers who are trying to shift the needle on this. And so this is a disappointing answer in some ways, because I don't have sort of firm recommendations, but to say that we should be listening to people like accessibility and polar research, and making sure that they're included in these conversations, and indeed centered at every level of decision making, from, as we've discussed throughout this panel, the framing of the questions and establishing what our priorities are, through to implementing the decisions that we've made, and rethinking our infrastructures, our practices, and so on.
Thank you, Morgan. And maybe I can just add to that in terms of Javier's question, saying that we don't have any takers. You don't need to have, you don't need to live in a country that has SCAR representation or is a member of SCAR to do Antarctic research. You can simply align yourselves with and contact anyone in the SCAR community. There's all these subgroups, action groups, expert groups, standing committees, and can get involved in their work. So we would welcome you or anyone who's not presently living in a country that is a SCAR member to be in touch, because in the future we have also seen that active research communities, for instance, in Turkey and other countries, then lead into SCAR membership for that country later on. Okay, does anyone want to add anything on the topic of representation and disabilities? If not, we'll turn our attention to another interesting question that has been posted by another, well, the same anonymous attendee, about how we can maximize scientific return while minimizing the human footprint in terms of Antarctic conservation. And I know that has been asked quite a lot, so I'd like you to share your thoughts on that. Any takers?
Well, I think that we must make it clear that there is no activity that is no zero impact in the environment. Of course, that we must be aware. And the great question, there are 2 points here. First, of course, if you're going to Antarctica, you must follow rules and protocols that avoid as much as possible your own impact. But the second question is that the great majority of the environment impact in Antarctica comes from outside Antarctica. Are the worldwide pollution, atmospheric pollution. Nowadays, we have a new challenge, like some fishing fleets are beginning to come into the Kamilar area without licenses. There are challenges that come from outside of the system too. And that is going to be a biggest challenge rather than the local impact. And I say local because, of course, around the stations, we have a greater impact done by ourselves or by people that administrate the station. But when you go to the great extent of Antarctica, we cannot forget the proportion of this impact. Of course, we must have areas of preservation. We have already the system of the treaty areas that we can keep apart of any kind of influence. It's essential, but we must have in mind what's really going on in terms of environment impact. It's much more things. It's much more important that things that come, for example, even from the northern hemisphere. The pollution, the contribution for pollution of the industrial activities in the northern hemisphere to Antarctic environment is greater, for example, from the countries in the southern hemisphere. And I think that a lot of times people are not aware about that, and to place too much weight in the scientific activity itself as a great impact in the environment.
Thank you, Jefferson. And I think that also goes hand in hand with what Priscilla said earlier with regard to her thought experiment. How can we possibly make the most of the understanding that we already have and actually stimulate action? But you do want to add on to that, Priscilla?
I do, and I want to refer back to something Morgan has discussed, which is structural change. That so let me throw it to the audience here. Which is likely to have more impact on Antarctica? turning off all the lights at Scott Base when we don't need them, or perhaps bringing waste back from Scott Base to ensure there's no extra waste in Antarctica, or doing something like reducing fossil fuels and banning flights as they are now worldwide. So sometimes we can get caught up in the detail and forget that there are many, many actions that we can take globally that have a huge impact on Antarctica.
Exactly.
Thank you, Scilla. Claire?
I just wanted to point out that, Heather Lynch had a very good comment in the Q&A about the use of new technologies that can help us have lower environmental impact. And I guess something that, people ask, if you work for an environmental organization, people often ask you, what can I do to fight climate change? And I know there is often a debate about personal action versus structural action. But I like to think of the IPCC in one of their recent reports talked about the need for societal transformations, and society is all of us. So I don't think it's necessarily either or. I think you can advocate for, say, your Antarctic research station to put a filter on their laundry so they're not discharging microplastics into the water, which we know will be there forever. And you can go back home and go outside your elected representative's house and yell at them until they, vote for some emissions reduction plan. So I think it's back to the old slogan from, I'm not sure if it was the 80s or 90s, but it's, think globally, act locally. So I think there are lots of things that Antarctic researchers can probably do to minimize their individual footprint. There was a study that came out this year that said that there is a measurable black carbon impact from local human activities. So that's maybe a key thing to focus on. But I also think just part of being better citizens of the world is to always be thinking about what can I do? And if you love Antarctica, you want to keep Antarctica, beautiful and untouched, or as untouched as it can be. So yeah, when you go to Antarctica, you can think about ways to do that. And then when you go back home, you can think about how can I make my country stop poisoning the atmosphere and ruining this place I love. So yeah, I think you can always be if you love Antarctica, you can always, maybe this sounds like a lot of an overwhelming challenge, but you can always be thinking about what can I do to protect this place I love, whether it's individual or structural.
And actually in Rebecca's beautiful essay that she wrote, it was interesting to me for two reasons. One is that every person that she mentioned in there was a white guy. So Tim, Nick and Richard, I'm shouting out to you for your wonderful work. But secondly, she talked about how scientists are often becoming vegan, that they're driving electric cars, that they are doing exactly what Claire said. So personal action throughout their lives, and we can all do that too, of course.
Humans are copycats. You never know who you're going to influence, so.
Thank you all. Let's briefly shift our attention to the most recent upsetting event that all of us in the world experience, and that's a pandemic. And we've got a question here from an anonymous attendee who's asking all of you as researchers and human beings, how has the recent global pandemic affected or restricted the pace of ongoing global research on Antarctica and the Arctic as well? And what does it mean for us for the future? Have we hit the reset button? Have we come to realize certain things that need to be done differently? Open the room.
I wish I could say that they told us we don't need to travel as much, but anybody who's been to Europe recently will know that people travel as it's going to be shut down again very soon. But yeah, on a more serious note, I think, of course, it influenced, especially people with long-term field projects. In a very real way, the ability to gather data, it affected scientists in general. their day-to-day ability to do their work, do their research. There's lots of research about women in academia, especially suffering during the pandemic, in terms of publication, etc. But I also think we should get some positive things from this. Hopefully it did show us that we don't need to travel as much as before. Hopefully we can now utilize technologies we have to have more inclusive conferences, where your ability to attend a conference doesn't depend on the size of your travel budget. Of course, there's inequalities in that as well. In-person conferences have the benefits. Hybrid conferences are often very uncomfortable to deal with and tricky, but it showed us that there is actually human capacity to do major changes to their daily lives on very short notice. So the capacity is there to do that. The will sometimes just lacks. So yes, I think it has, for most of us, even us in Sweden with its interesting approach to the pandemic, it still has had an impact both on personal, professional, and global level. But I think it also showed, especially the way in which ComNet, for example, reacted to trying to get best practices in place in time. That to show, again, there is actually capacity for humanity to make changes. It's just perhaps I don't know what kind, I don't want the disaster to happen for us to do that. The disaster is already happening, but still, perhaps we can see that also as a little bit of a message of hope.
Thank you, Lize-Marie. And I mean, that capacity to change things and choose, we do have to keep in mind that, as also Monica Milberg pointed out just in the Q&A, that this option is not equally available to all people in the world, and that as she wrote, it's important to keep in mind that, for instance, the green options are not available everywhere. Electric cars are not options in several countries where people live below the poverty line. So we need to adjust to expectations and in terms of local realities. And I think this is quite true, and that's always something that we tend to forget, because we are all in fairly privileged positions. I mean, anyone doing Antarctic research and participating in this panel discussion and in this conference, in fact, is privileged in one way or another, much more so than the majority of people in the world. And I think our challenge is also to ensure that we can consider those viewpoints and those very different realities from our lived experience and take them into consideration. And talking about, as Monica did, about the green options in this context, I mean, from my understanding, those people living below the poverty line are actually the lowest emitters and the ones with the lowest carbon footprint in the world. It's more or less the wealthier and the big industry and those that are privileged that are unfortunately contributing to the main issues that are then adversely affecting those that already don't have a lot. And that's really a structural and a systemic issue, which we have to possibly keep in mind. And I realize I'm not a panelist, so I shouldn't be offering opinions, but I felt quite strongly about that and thought I needed to offer some thoughts on that. Very good point, Monica. So thank you for raising that. And then maybe back to a few more questions that have come in regarding equitable science and participation. And this is a question from Nikki Branson that goes beyond the ATCM and talks about SC CAMLR, the Scientific Committee of CAMLR, where out of 26 representatives in 2022, only 3 are female. So how can structural barriers be overcome to make participation in Southern Ocean science, and I hasten to add policy, I assume, Nikki, more equitable? Anyone?
I'm just going to start by reiterating data is key here. So keeping records exactly as you've just said, so that we know how many people are participating and who they are. I think that's the first thing that we need to do to improve, because without that data looking at us, looking straight back at us, it's very easy just to keep going as a status quo.
Thank you, and very good point to collect those data. Does anyone else have any thoughts? Morgan, do you have any thoughts on that? Sorry to put you on the spot there.
No, I have to admit that a message just came in about my son's daycare, so I had to divert my eyes for a moment. I'm really sorry, everybody.
That's okay. I'm sorry that all happens. I mean, we all have a life going on around us. Okay, I do invite everyone in the audience to put in their thoughts of how we can actually action this and make it more equitable, because I think that was the intention, to show pathways to action. So I encourage you all to consider that and possibly share your thoughts in the Q&A with everyone. We've had a few more questions and a discussion going on regarding big policy questions and how that relate to societal benefits and how they can be divided up into specific scientific research questions with hypotheses that can actually be answered by individual or research teams. And that was from Kevin Hughes, and there's again an interesting discussion there, but I wonder whether, and this is a bit out, probably out of some of your fields, but do you have any thoughts on how we can better transfer those policy issues and policy questions and the questions that policymakers ask us, for instance, in the ATCM or possibly SC CAMLA, into actionable scientific research questions? And I take stunned silence as essentially, Kevin, you've been asking a very difficult question, but Claire has some thoughts on that.
Well, again, I think Heather makes an important point in the Q&A where she says that scientists need to refuse to do policy-oriented research that is being requested as a means of policy delay. And I think one unfortunate thing that I'm seeing in the climate science realm and the Antarctic science realm is that talking about science has almost become a weapon. You know, there's this concept at CAMLR of best available science. And, you know, a lot of times there's constant debates over, do we have the best available science? We need more information. You know, and even when there is a lot of information, it's like, well, you know, we don't need to do anything with this information. It's really great. Thank you to SCAR for presenting it. But, you know, this is just science. We need to keep it purely science. It should be separated from policy. So unfortunately, I think that, you know, that this is exactly the case, that some of these kind of questions to scientists are not being made in good faith. So I think that's very unfortunate. But I think scientists should maybe cut themselves a break sometimes, because they are communicating things very clearly and communicating, you know, recommended, you know, communicating the implications for policy very clearly. And then they're being told, oh, this is not enough information. We don't have the right information. And I don't think that's accurate. So, you know, many scientists, yeah. So many of the scientists out there, don't feel bad if, you know, if people took all your great work and then said, oh, this isn't good enough, because it probably was. Those people just don't want to make a difficult decision.
I need to tell a story. You are being quite optimist. Why I'm saying that, some years ago, I'm not going to tell which country, it came in with a pressure from one national research council that we should not put too much effort looking the climate and the system, and we should pay attention to extraterrestrial worlds and astronomy in Antarctica. I'm not going to say anything more than that, but this kind of pressure that sometimes we suffer, and that comes exactly. It is really intentional to try to avoid deep questions. And I agree totally with you, Claire. The signal is there. We have been working for more than 30 years about the different scenarios of climate change, saying what's going to happen is happening. We are seeing now. If you look into the Arctic, it's much more clear than Antarctica. And at the first time, of course, they try to, some politicians, do more research and so on. As the thing was becoming clearer and clearer, it became some groups, and I'm not going to say which one, because different countries have different ideological groups denying all the process. And it's really denial. And if you study the question, what's behind the strategy that's behind that, it goes back there to the publicity and propaganda and public relation campaign of tabagism, and to use the same technique to deny climate change and other process that we are observing in the environment system. So it's something much deeper and much more, I worry much more than the way that we acted by ourselves in Antarctica. It's unfortunate. The last 4 or 5 years have been very tough for a lot of colleagues of us, and I can say even for my country, that people that they are against the knowledge at all, against science. And that is going to be the struggle for the next 10 years, I think. And of course, we are not a part of it.
Thank you, Jefferson. I think that's a really important reminder to all of us, and relates back to what Heather suggested about a code of ethics among scientists who need to refuse to do policy-oriented research that is being requested as a means of policy delay. I totally echo that, but Priscilla, you had something to add.
Yeah, I do actually. I just want to think about the role of the media as well. And I'm going to use a personal example here. So some of the work that our team have been doing, and I'd particularly like to shout out here to Priscilla Watani and Billy Van Utrecht and Nigel Scott. So this is work we did with the Runanga o Ngaitahu. Because we're working with Indigenous paradigms, we are very interested in connection to Antarctica and relationality. So as part of that work, we wrote about narratives of connection, and Hui Te Rangiora, who's a famous explorer in these narratives, and how he may have visited Antarctica. So these are really important narratives, they're ways of connecting people. But we were actually incredibly disturbed by the way that that work has been taken up in the media and repackaged really in what I'd call an imperialist agenda, where it's become about who was first to reach Antarctica, and seems to have become somehow about claims, territorial claim, and this, what Morgan's been talking about, this need to plant a flag or to be first. And this is not the purpose of our work. Our work is about relationality and connection. So I think it's really difficult as a researcher sometimes to foresee how your work can be repackaged in these different ways when its purpose was actually different. So I think this is something that we all do need to think about more. It certainly took us by surprise.
Thank you, Scylla. I think that's also a good reminder that the media does sometimes take us by surprise, and you cannot ever prepare for all eventualities and all interpretations. We've got one more question by Dr. Avinash in the Q&A, which is a hypothetical and asks about should mining in Antarctica be allowed in 50 years' time? And if so, what environmental measures should be in place to control it? I think that's a very big question, but if anyone dares to say anything in response to that, Claire.
Well, I can answer this one because, again, I'm with an environmental NGO, so we have a very clear position on this. And the answer is no. And the Antarctic Treaty actually would make it very difficult to end the current ban on mining. There would need to be a new legally binding international instrument in place. It would need to have an overwhelming amount of buy-in from Antarctic Treaty consultative parties, which I don't think it'll have. But other than that, I mean, for all we've talked about the effects of climate change today and how they're real and how we see them happening, in our lifetimes, how insane would we have to be to start mining oil and gas in Antarctica in 50 years? I mean, we might as well all commit mass suicide because humanity is doomed if we have not changed our ways by that point. So, again, going back to the ways of thinking in different paradigms, throughout much of human history, because something is there, we have assumed that we should take it and use it. And I think we need a new paradigm where we ask, what can we do to support nature so that our species can survive, instead of saying, what can we take from nature? How much of it, before it all collapses? So I know this wasn't maybe the general purpose of this panel, but, Antarctica is actually a place where we've kind of created with the treaty and the environmental protocol and the ban on mining, we did kind of create a new paradigm. We said, look, we're going to ban this activity before it even happens because we value this environment so much. We're not going to wait for damage. We're going to prevent damage. And I think that ethos needs to spread out from the rest of the world rather than the rest of the world's exploitation ethos spreading to Antarctica.
Thank you, Claire. Well said. And I think also, as Scylla reminded us before, we are actually a part of nature. We are not sitting aside. There cannot be a dichotomy between here's humans and there's nature. We are part of it, and every action that we take has an effect, and it can hurt us if we exploit nature to greater extent than, well, as we already are actually. So I'd just like to ask everyone, I think we've covered most of those questions. I do have a final question for all panelists that I'd like them to respond to. But if there's anything we missed that has not been actually addressed, please let us know. I have kept some of the interesting side discussions open because I take it that people enjoy reading them and are still responding. So now to a final question for all of you. Given the range of social, economic, and environmental challenges now facing the world, what one thing might SCAR do to advocate for the continued relevance of funding Antarctic research? Who wants to go first?
I can go first. And just to thank everybody for coming as well, and what a delight it is to be on a panel like this. But I'd like to advocate for more interdisciplinary research and interdisciplinary teams, because I think when we have complex problems, and these are complex systems problems, where one thing affects other things in a system, and there are feedback loops, that result from the actions that are taken within a system. I think really interdisciplinary teams or transdisciplinary teams are the way to actually go to create effective solutions. So rather than doing more of the same, we need to actually think laterally and do that. And by interdisciplinary teams, I'm also going to put in a plug for diverse teams as part of that, so that the people who are currently invisible do have voice and bring their immense skills and perspectives and abilities to the table as well.
Thank you, Scylla. Anyone else? Lize-Marie.
Yes, I think the one thing that it can do is continue to have a high level of transparency and integrity in providing independent scientific advice. And that scientific advice should include the best available science that also says that the humanities, the social sciences, interdisciplinarity, diversity in teams, all these things that Silla also mentioned, that is actually part of the best available science at the moment, and to advocate for that, but most of all to keep its integrity and try and maintain that.
Yeah, I agree with you all these points that you brought. But the main question, I think that we must make our colleagues, even science colleagues of other areas, to understand that there isn't Antarctic science. There is science in Antarctica. The science of Antarctica nowadays is totally integrated with all other investigations on the environment of this planet. And that science is an integral part. We cannot put apart the two polar regions. And that comes exactly the several points that we are discussing here, that yes, during the time of the Arctic exploration, even during the IPY, even during the 1970s, the science in Antarctica was something apart. Basic geological mapping, investigations just to know the place, and of course with that this kind of adventure, certainly the kind of male club, and for the 12 countries club that would not integrate the rest of the world. That has gone. We have a different situation, and where it's becoming clear in our understanding of the environment system that the polar region is an integral part, and that for a lot of people it is still not known. It's a challenge in education. It's a challenge in our universities. That comes with education and how to insert the knowledge of this information that we have in general in science and of course outside. And yes, it's interdisciplinary. And but yeah, difficult times, strange times, we need to work together with our other areas, and that's essential to include the social sciences, the humanities, working with the natural science.
Thank you, Jefferson. And over to Morgan.
I think that Jefferson has touched on a lot of the essence of the point that I was going to raise, which is that it's hard to say what one thing should SCAR do, because I think that SCAR is well aware of how very many things it must do, and it is doing well, and how many more, how much further we have to go. But I might say if we had to think about one thing to keep in mind, I would emphasize how important it is to reframe Antarctica as a space that's exceptional in some ways, but is very deeply entangled with the rest of the world, with the natural systems we're impacted by, and we are impacting the entire rest of the world, ecosystems, climate impacts on human societies as well. And then in that vein also, that what happens in Antarctica on a human level is also deeply and intrinsically entangled with societies, cultures, and politics around the world. As much as we like to imagine that science is neutral, as Claire said early on, we all have biases, and as a community, we have certain biases that are, overarching, we might say, and it's really important for us to acknowledge that we are not neutral, that we have a long way to go to accept to acknowledge and redress the historical processes that have kept us from advancing socially and therefore scientifically, because as somebody said earlier, I can't remember who, diverse teams produce better science, and also to acknowledge and address the challenges that are still in front of us to make sure that Antarctic research is truly an endeavor that is by and for all humanity, as we claim to be, and not just for a privileged few.
Well said, Morgan. Well said. Okay. Claire, Lize-Marie, did you want to say anything else in response? No. Perfect. So we've had one other question which I've tried to address in the chat, and a nice reminder from Kevin also about the that it's good to stay vigilant with regard to obviously the protocol, which could be potentially open for review in 2048, which is none of which is automatic. Do we have any final comments from you? Any closing words that you want to share with us? Anyone of the panelists?
Oh, that's all right.
I feel like Morgan should just say that bit again about how entangled Antarctica is with the rest of the world, because I think that really does cut to the crux of it. So I'm all for you, Morgan, saying it again.
Look out for my paper with Hannah Nielsen, Meredith Nash, and Renuka Bade, hopefully next year. But yeah, just to emphasize that Antarctica is in some ways exceptional, but is really deeply and intrinsically entangled with the natural and human systems around the world. And that's something that has implications for climate, for policy, for social progress, for inclusivity and equality, for everything that we do in this community as Antarctic researchers.
Thank you, Morgan. And thank you, Scylla, for asking Morgan to say that again. You say it so well that we could have you almost on an advertisement saying that to the rest of the world. But no, that just leaves me to really thank all of the panelists for your excellent contributions and really, really thought-provoking comments, which I'm really glad now we recorded in the hope that you agree with making that available later on. It was an excellent discussion and I really enjoyed stepping in for Peter here. And also thank you to everyone who participated in the Q&A and in the discussion and followed the debate. We've had some wonderful site discussions going on, and I'd actually like to ask the SCAR IT team to capture those because I'm worried that we might be losing the Q&A otherwise. There were some really great points in there, and we all look forward to engaging further and to continuing the discussions that were just starting points that reminded us really of the integrated character of Antarctica, the connectedness to the rest of the world, and the importance of not losing sight of some of our ethical challenges and also prerogatives and responsibilities to ensure that everyone is taken along for the journey, and that some of those really challenging issues around equity and diversity, as well as the voices of different voices that are there in the world that are there to be heard and integrated, to be considered. I realize we are finishing a bit early, but we should leave it on a really good note. And I think we have had a very thorough discussion on topics, so I'd be very comfortable finishing now unless anyone has any other points to end with. But thank you all.
Thank
That was
you.
great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yummy.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We should finish the recording, possibly.